What's it like to be a content designer or a UX writer working on a large language model? Join me today as I speak with someone who's doing exactly that and learn how you, as a content designer, can move into working on AI yourself. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Writers of Silicon Valley. My name is Patrick Stafford. I'm your host. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the UX Content Collective. And welcome back for another episode. I am especially excited for today because this is the first repeat guest that I've had on the podcast. So far, I think in 28 episodes, I've only had new guests, but today it's the first person who's come back, which I think is a good thing. We had a great conversation, so yeah, I definitely think it's a good thing. Look, as always, thank you to everyone who's given feedback on the episode so far. Sounds like everyone's enjoying them, but if there's anything that you want to hear more of or less of, please let me know. Feedback's always good. So email me at patrick@uxcontent.com or leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen. I always get feedback and love it. So please continue doing that. So today, my guest is Ben Barone-Nugent. Now, Ben, if you recall, if you've listened to the previous episode with Ben on, he used to work at Netflix as a content designer, and he has now moved over to Google, where he is working on Gemini. So he's working on, or one of the people working on, the Gemini chatbot product. And this is a really fascinating conversation. So we've had a few conversations so far about what it's like as a content designer or a UX writer to work with AI and how we can develop features that use AI and so on. This is the first conversation I've had with someone where they're actually working on not just the chat experience, but working, I guess, at the base level. Google is one of the major contributors to this AI race that's happening right now, and their language model is gaining in, I guess, competitiveness. I mean, it's just contributing to this huge conversation we're having right now. So it's been a really interesting conversation to have with Ben about not just how you use AI in your own work, but what it's like to work at the front, really, of what's going on. And we have a really great conversation about this new avenue for content design and UX writing that's opening. So you don't just have to think of AI as this external force that's sort of crushing your ability to work. This is actually an opportunity for us to get involved, and Ben's doing that, and at one of the biggest players in the industry. So I think it's it's an interesting conversation. There's obviously things that we need to be careful of with AI, but the fact that there are jobs and opportunities opening up for content people to come in and guide how it's used, not just through product or on a feature level, but also ethically, and to make sure that there's good use going on there, I think is great. So we had a really great conversation. Really hope you enjoy it. If you're interested at all in the intersection of content and AI, I think you'll get a lot out of it. So a quick note for today. You may notice that the audio quality in today's episode is not as good for my voice. That's because, unfortunately, I used my laptop microphone instead of my fancy microphone. So I'm sorry about that. You can still hear me fine. It's just not as good as it usually is. Okay. Well, again, thank you for tuning in. I really hope you get a lot out of today's conversation. Any feedback, please let me know. Patrick@uxcontent.com. And I'll go away now, and here's my conversation with Ben Barone-Nugent from the Google Gemini team. Last time you were on the podcast, which, by the way, was one of the most popular episodes. People love that podcast and still download it and still listen to it.
Wonderful.
But last time we chatted, you were at Netflix.
Exactly.
Now you're not at Netflix. So you were working on a whole bunch of cool stuff there. So what led you to leave there and get to where you are now, which is at Google?
Great question. So I think Netflix was awesome, and I think I think a lot about my time there. I was there for a little over 3 years, and when I think back, it did feel like getting a masterclass in like UX, because it was like such a small team with like such a refined craft and product focus approach and such like great like philosophy around experimentation and testing and using data to do all this stuff that I just like learned so much. And I brought a lot of that to Google. And so like I think a lot about that night. So I have like extremely fond memories of that time. I think what it came down to was sort of two things. A lot of products that I was really excited about shipping were kind of behind me and stuff was coming down the pike. And it was just like, okay, is this really where I want to be? Like, is it more of the same or is it going to be different or great? And a team at Google who was led by somebody who I was really excited about working with, who coincidentally left a couple of weeks after I started, which happens and it was fine, was sort of said, hey, I've got a great role, would love to talk to you about it. And the timing just felt right. So it was one of those things of like, it felt like a good time to make that transition. And I was excited about what was on the other side of that. So it was nothing really about like the company or anything like that. Well, I guess maybe it was because I think I had always kind of wanted to have Google on my resume. It's just one of those companies and they were doing some interesting stuff. But yeah, that's kind of it. It's a bit of a
It's
boring
kind of
story.
bit of a boring story,
Yeah,
but like it just seems like Netflix now they've hired so many more content designers. I
me
don't know how
too.
big the team is now, but the practice there is pretty well defined, and it just seems like it would have been an interesting, as you just said, it was an interesting few years,
For
and
sure.
I really enjoyed the blog post that was published after we talked
Hmm.
about Shakespeare, the
Yeah,
testing system. I thought that was really really
awesome.
cool,
Yeah, I
and
think my manager
yeah,
Jen wrote that, and she's great. She built out that team and really carved out an identity for it. And it was like such a pleasure to sort of just see how a lot of people who I got to know really well, some of whom I helped hire, were just like growing and really pioneering stuff. And yeah, it's just a delight to see. But yeah, the some of the stuff they did around like language testing, they really cared about language, which is awesome, right?
yeah.
And I think there is, that really showed up in the product and shows up in like how successful the business is too.
Yeah, I just thought like the now that you've a bit removed from Netflix, and we'll talk about Google in a second.
Mhm.
But one of the things that you hear a lot about is that that rigorous culture,
Yeah.
and the idea that you're constantly not having to prove yourself necessarily. At
Mhm.
least that's not how I see it from the outside, with no experience, inside.
For
But
sure,
you just
yeah.
hear a lot about how like it's treated as a sports team, and they want people who are giving their best and
Of course,
a
yeah.
game and so on. And it's often portrayed in kind of like a harsh, like, wow, this is like super serious
Yeah.
vibe.
Yeah.
But you speak positively of your time there, so it can't really have been as intense as maybe some people might think,
You know,
or yeah.
I the way I thought about it at the time and now reflecting back on it, I think in some ways it was not that different to like other well-established companies, tech companies, agencies, whatever. And in some sense, there's like a lens you can put on it where it was maybe a little more humane. And
Hmm.
I'll just talk a little bit about both those things. But in terms of it not being that different, I mean, every company expects a lot from all these big prestigious companies expect a lot from their employees. It's pretty simple, right? Um, and they all have systems for ensuring that that balance is maintained, whether it's, you get put on a performance plan or there's like hard conversations, et cetera, et cetera. Netflix's was just a little bit more out in the open, I think,
Hmm.
and they encouraged managers to just be more like blunt with their teams about how they were performing. So it wasn't like you just like show up one day and you're out. It was like,
Yeah,
in the same way that like Meta or Amazon will put you on a plan to try and get you there, your manager will have a conversation with you and say, hey, look, falling a bit short in these areas. It's just a little less formal. So then they will like,
yeah,
you're expected to figure out how you address it. So in that sense, it wasn't too different.
yeah,
And for people who I did see get sort of caught up in that, they were given like warnings and it was not always a surprise. So and honestly, they all went on to do amazing things, right? Like some of them went on to be like directors at Google or like
mm,
a VP of design at Hulu and stuff like that. So in a lot of cases, it was, a cruel to be kind kind of scenario. But
Yeah, but it's also like one of those things where not every person is going to thrive in the same environment. Like
exactly.
just because you're
Yeah,
going to do really well in that type of environment
exactly.
doesn't mean that you're going to do well in a different one. And it
Exactly.
often has no real bearing on you as a person or the quality of your work.
Absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely not. And I think it was like, I think, and in what I was saying about it being like more humane in a lot of ways, I think what was interesting about that is like you always kind of knew where you stood, right? Like every
Mm,
manager and every person there had some hard conversations at some point because they cared about doing great work, they cared about the product, they cared about the user, and that means sometimes you got to like be honest with each other about the work that's getting done, and I respected that, right? And I took a lot
mm,
of that like honesty and directness with me, and I try to keep it to this day. I try to adapt it to the people, obviously, who I'm working with, and the culture of the company and the team, but it's valuable, and I kind of
yeah.
like that.
I really like that too. I can't remember if I mentioned this last time when we spoke, but when I was at MYOB, they implemented what was essentially a monthly performance review. And
Interesting.
it was a structured conversation where it was like, I put down, so I was in a meeting with my manager and I put
Hmm.
down, what have you worked on? What are you proud of?
Cool.
Like, what do you think you could have improved on? And what's currently stopping you from doing your best work at the minute? And so, it's part sort of like self review. And then you gave yourself a rating at the end,
Right.
according to like the internal rating system.
Right.
And I love those conversations because they either validated what I was feeling or they put me on the right path. And
For
so
sure.
if there was any sort of misalignment, I was able to go, oh, cool, I know what you're
Gotcha.
thinking now. I'll go down this path now.
Yep.
And I just found that, like, once you get over the first couple and you start thinking to yourself, like, no, I'm
Yeah.
not going to be fired, like,
Yeah.
you start getting, I found it very comforting, to get more feedback rather than walking into like a half yearly or yearly performance review thinking like, oh my god, like what's about to happen. So I agree.
Exactly. No, I it's better to know where you stand than it is to, like, be left to, you know, to your own imagination, right? Because
Mm,
we're a lot of us, all of us are our own hardest critics, and of course, if we suspect that our manager's not happy with us, but they're not telling us, then of course we're gonna assume that we're about to get fired, right? But when your manager's
yep.
like, you can trust them to be very direct with you, you're always like, "Okay, great, that meeting was good. I can just keep forging on." And when I was managing a UX team here at Google, I tried to implement a lot of practices around that, which is like, you know,
Mm,
let's always be talking about where I think you're doing well, where I think you can have more focus. But I wanted them to like understand that they're always going to hear it from me. And if they're not hearing anything from me, that's good news. So as
yeah.
long as we get into that habit of a no news is good news kind of situation, I think you're on a good track. You know, you
Yeah.
have to mold it to the person you're sort of coaching and mentoring and managing, but by and large, I found it to be good, like a pretty good principle.
Good. I know that you've said before you're working on like AI model design.
Mhm.
What specifically have you been working on? Include as much detail as possible that all of Google's competitors can listen and figure
Yes.
out what exactly you're doing.
Exactly, exactly.
Just,
So I'm
but
gonna
in
spill the
general though,
beans.
like what are you working on?
I was on ads. I was like leading that team that I mentioned, and we had my father-in-law got quite unwell, so I wanted to step back from managing so I could like spend some time, uh, really focusing on family and my wife and stuff, which was a good choice. And I stayed on the ads team, but I went back to sort of being an IC, and I started leading a lot of like regulatory work, which was really cool. And I fell back in love with just the solid workbench. And I think that's kind of been my calling, right? Is like making stuff. I love to get my hands dirty. I love managing people and growing teams and stuff like that. But there's such pleasure and delight in just building stuff. And so I really just fell back in love with that side of things. And then did that for a while, got all that DMA stuff over the line, which I do not want to bore anyone with. Although you folks can find my email and you can ask me if you're interested. But yeah, this a role just kind of popped up working on Bard at that point. This was before they renamed it Gemini, with a manager who I had known for years, a wonderful manager called Morgan Quinn. She's still here. She's great. And I was like, you know what? Why not? This seems cool and hot and like interesting, and they're doing some innovative stuff. So I just like threw my hat in the ring, and there was an interesting role, and I just was like, yeah, why not? just do the rounds at Google. I'd been on ads for about a year and a half, so it just felt right. So I've been on the Gemini team now for about a year. And the stuff that I'm working on is, I would say at a high level, is like thinking about how do we deepen Gemini's abilities at serving very specific types of problems.
Hmm.
So an example of this, which was just announced at I/O, that I wasn't working directly on this, one of my counterparts was, but I work very closely with her on these sorts of things. But this is the best example. Um, is like planning a holiday, right? So how
Okay.
can Gemini be a really good like collaborator on a plan for a trip to Paris?
Hmm.
And my collaborator, she's a conversation designer, thinking through, okay, conversationally, how do we do that? What UI elements does it bring in? And like, what does that experience need to be like?
Hmm.
Those are the sorts of problems that I'm working on. The things that I've been thinking most about has been data analyst capabilities for Gemini. So if I'm run a restaurant and I have a spreadsheet of like my bookings and sales for the past few months, upload that to Gemini and ask it questions about the data, get it to visualize the data. So again, like, yeah, the team that I'm working on and really trying to help like galvanize and lead is thinking about, yeah, we call it expertise, but what we're really doing is just like making Gemini really good at really specific things.
Got it. So this is really fascinating to me because I think there's this area that content designers are carving out for themselves, doing
Yeah.
what you're doing, but it hasn't yet because these roles are being filled by existing content designers.
Hmm.
There haven't really been job ads for them,
Yeah.
or they haven't been sort of advertised, and so it's kind of like this secret little
Yeah.
job that's happening in a bunch of different companies. I
Yeah.
just had an episode with Eladrian Goods at Intuit,
Oh,
and she
awesome.
was saying, "Yep, my team's working on like LLM based products," and
Yeah.
I've spoken to a few other people doing the same thing.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because it seems to me like there's a few different elements to it. At the top, you have the the I guess what you would call the micro copy or the user interface copy for
Right.
someone using the
Yeah.
product, right? So informing them like, hey, check the facts here. This might not always be accurate. Make sure it's experimental, blah, blah, blah.
Right. Right.
Then you've got the conversation design aspect of it, which you just alluded to, which is the actual interaction with the if it's a chatbot, then the chat based experience, right? But then you also have at that bottom layer I guess what you would call the structured data layer,
Hmm.
where you're depending on what you're building, looking at the training data and how that's being structured
Right.
and how it's being fed into the model itself. And in some areas that can be quite simple, and in others
Sure.
very, very large and sophisticated,
Right.
like Gemini. And it's just interesting that there's this um, interaction between all of these different people, like conversation designers and
Hmm.
content designers and machine learning experts
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
analysts and so on, to create some pretty interesting experiences. And I don't know, it just sounds really exciting to
It
be able
is,
to
and I
work on a
think
team
what's
like that.
I'm with you, and it is really exciting, and that's obviously a big draw for like me to join the team. But like what I'm seeing is actually, um, the singularity of this is like, what is a great experience? And
Mm,
I think that we're like all collapsing into that singularity pretty quickly. What I mean by
mm,
that is, yeah, we had conversation and content designers and UX designers and whoever else kind of orbiting this thing. And we had these, like, as you were sort of outlining, like distinct roles in the ecosystem. But that singularity gets heavier and heavier as people expect more and more, which means companies have to move faster and faster. And suddenly we just fall into it. And now we're all kind of doing the same thing. And I really see that
mm,
happening a lot at Google and elsewhere. And and that's happened to me, right? Like I came into this team as a content designer. It's still my title, but everything I have to do is conversation design with like a
mm,
smattering of like traditional, and I'm doing scare quotes for anyone listening, content design, right? And so
mm,
that's been really interesting. So those lines are blurring really, really
mm,
quickly. And I think that's good. I think that's a good thing. And I
mm,
think that philosophically that's good. I think for users that's good. And I think for teams and companies that's good. And like what's been really interesting about that is like seeing like the real, it's for me, it's really clarified some things that content designers are good at that I kind of always knew, but now I'm like really seeing clearly. And that's thinking about like the flow of information. To give you an
Mm.
example, like what happens when a model needs to partially generate the content of a UI element, right? Like let's say there's like a
Mhm.
quiz or something, and that quiz is populated based on a conversation. There need to be patterns into that quiz, right? It can't just be completely
Mm.
random. And who's good at like figuring out those patterns? Content designer. So then that content designer
Mm.
needs to own that like strategy, figure out like how do we train a model to do that reliably, and how
Mhm.
do we make sure that that then like ties into the way that a human expects to be able to talk to that machine. Now we're talking about like this hybrid UX design, content design, conversation design thing. That's
Mm.
cool. And like
Mm.
that's what I'm really excited about the future of the discipline is that I think it's creating a hell of a lot of work for people like us, and that's really good.
Mm.
But it's also forcing us to reckon with what we do and how we bring value. That's really good. It's extending our utility to companies and our influence over product. That's really good. So it's an exciting time from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the things that you just outlined, I think, is the idea that you're going into this type of experience
Yeah,
and you're having to learn a little bit of conversation design, a little bit of whatever. Going into this type of team and this type of work, what did you have to learn that you didn't quite sort of know or have a grasp on going into it? Was it like
yeah,
you
great
had
question.
to learn the ins and outs of the models, or was it specific,
Yeah,
technical aspects, or like what did you have to sort of get up to speed on in order to do the work properly?
great question. So I want to be clear about like the level, the type of work that I'm doing that may be different from what other teams at other companies are doing. So I'm really working at like the front lines of like the model. Now, I don't want to say that in a way that makes it sound like my work's more important or anything. It just changes the nature of the way I do the job. But to your point, there's going to be a lot of relations between anyone working on LLMs or AIs. So the things that I had to learn, there was a lot. I really feel like I'm doing a different job than I was 14 months ago in a good way, but not a totally different job. Just the nature of it's a little bit different. The principles are pretty similar. And so, like, to give you a really crystal clear example, I had to come to terms with the idea that when I was working on regulatory stuff on ads, I was writing, settings pages and flows that would be the same, exactly the same. They legally had to be the same for every user who saw them. I then had to reckon with owning a product where I had no control or very little control over what the content that a user would see.
Mm.
That's a big shift for somebody like me who's been doing content design for 15 years. It's like now it's like, oh God, I'm giving it these like frameworks and like guidance, but like at the end, and I'm shaping this experience, but I don't know what it's going to choose. And that because it's got to
Mm.
depend on things, right? And it's like, you know, thinking again, more scare quotes. But that was a big shift. But then there was like, okay, if I'm like shaping an experience, what does my workflow need to look like? And that's where I felt like in a lot of ways, I was starting to operate more like a product designer, where I
Mm-hmm.
would start with like a cohesive sort of experience and then deconstruct it and work backwards. So let me tell you a bit about what I mean by that. So some of the work that I'm doing with this data analyst feature that was announced is going to be usable pretty soon in the next few weeks or months. You need to think a bit about like, okay, in certain circumstances, what does an output need to look like for a specific request? So let's say somebody will ask you to visualize some data that they give, right? Then I'm thinking of like, okay, I talk to data analysts, engineers, people who are experts in that sort of stuff, and then I think what was a nice organic conversation? What reasoning do you need to see? What don't you need to see? Excuse me, how do you talk about like errors in the data? So then I would think about like, okay, what does that final conversation output need to be? Then I work backwards. And by working backwards, there's a couple of things that I would then do. I would like deconstruct that conversation. Are there components that we can standardize and scale and have like specific principles around? Um, like how do we like relate those things to like a specific request? How does it reflect language and stuff? You can start to break that down. Then you start to deconstruct into like, okay, now that we kind of know what the general outputs should be for these different, user needs, basically, then it's like, okay, what training data do we need to create for that? Do we need to
Mm,
do reinforcement learning? Do we need to produce like golden examples, which are like example conversations that you do at like great volume? Do you need to do like specific fine tuning? And then there's like, how do we evaluate if it's consistently producing good outputs? So you need to come up with guidelines for that. And so that's sort of how my workflow changed a lot. So what I
mm.
outlined there doesn't sound exactly like a product designer thing, but like in its principle, it's kind of like you think about what it needs to be, then you break off the contingent parts and figure them out separately.
Yeah, it's essentially product requirements, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, but it just so
Exactly.
happens that a lot of the requirements here is actually content. And it's
All
interesting to
content.
me in
Yeah.
kind of conversations with people, like how people underestimate just how much content is needed to make these models work well. And a
Yeah.
lot of the content that you'll never see, like you just illustrated, like just lists of examples. I mean, we just um, obviously this model is not anywhere near as extensive and we're just using GPT, but we have an assistant now in our fundamentals course
Great.
because we had a need that people wanted a course search and we could never
Oh,
quite get it
cool.
right. But so what we did was
Smart.
we've used a third party vendor and we've trained it on the course data.
That's great.
But you can't just use the course data.
Yeah.
You then have to then create like
Yeah. Yeah.
example conversations
Yep.
about how you want it to work, and
Mhm.
you have to do it and then test it and be like, oh, that didn't work quite the way we wanted
Exactly.
it
Yeah.
to, and then test it again. And
Yeah.
there's just a huge amount of content that just has to be fed into these things to make them work
Absolutely.
properly.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it is really interesting. I think when I was I think before I really jumped in with both feet into this sort of space, 'cause there was always smatterings of AI stuff in Google Ads, which is always really interesting. Um, there was I think, a lot of anxiety out there amongst content designers, UX writers, even product designers about how AI and access to LLMs was gonna impact our jobs. And what I'm seeing is that there are problems that these products have, not like broken problems, but like things that need to be solved that, only content designers can really solve, right? And like
Yeah,
content kind of
yeah.
include conversation designers in that too. But we've always dealt with like information and how do you communicate that and the flow of that information, the voice of like that information. And that's what we're talking about with LLMs. And what's interesting too is like people talk about like, well, what happens when LLMs are like no longer like just text based? It's like, yeah, but it's still information, right? There's still going to be
Mm,
words. It's not like, there are content designers working on banking apps that may not have a huge number of words, right? But
mm,
somebody needs to think about this stuff. And, when we're starting to introduce things like, okay, how do we make models safe? How do we make models equitable? How do we make models inclusive? You need someone to think about that in great depth because the
mm,
scale and function of these things gets away from you if you're not having people think about it. And honestly, it's been in the headlines for a lot of different AI companies. It's really important. It will tank the stock price. It will kill trust. It will make a broken product. We're
mm.
needed, we're valued, and I think that's really cool. And it's just so interesting to see that shift. And I think another thing too is like there's a lot of consternation as well about like, well, if the model can write words, is it going to replace us? And I just think that like to your point, somebody needs to train it how to write those words, right?
Yeah,
Not
yeah,
like, and it's not
yeah.
like those words are always going to be the same, and it's not like the model's static and it's just never changes. It does. You need human intervention to make an LLM usable. So,
Yeah.
headline being
I
is I'm
think like
very positive about the future of our discipline.
Yeah, I mean, and it's good to hear someone say that, in the position that you're in as well,
Yeah.
almost like at the forefront of what's going on. But I think like what's even more interesting is the idea that, well, I think for one, I think some people are nervous as well because a lot of the work that you're talking about now
Hmm.
is a little bit opaque in that, as I mentioned before, no one's really advertising for these roles. So that it's
Yeah.
kind of, this work is kind of hidden a little bit. It's not secret, but it's like people are sort of jumping over to those roles and working on them in that sense. So that's sort of one aspect of it.
Yeah.
I think the other thing too is you touched on something earlier where you said we're creating parameters and we're creating guidelines to
Hmm.
help guide sort of content at scale. I just did an episode with Ron Yakar at Monday.com,
Great.
and
Awesome.
he's created a model that is based around the company's style guide to help designers write.
Oh,
And it's
actually, I
yeah,
think I've read
super
about this. Yeah,
interesting.
because he's like a one-man show at Monday, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, he is.
smart. That's great.
Yeah, it's a really interesting interview, and he talks
Yeah.
about the process he's gone into building it. And I think like when you have a language model w- in any type of format, it then really democratizes content at scale.
Right.
And so I think the question that we all need to be reckoning with is how do you maintain quality at scale? Like all of a sudden
Well,
now
yeah.
we're kind of becoming like go with me with this analogy.
Yeah,
But
for
if
sure.
we're if content designers are sheepdogs, right? Before we might have had a few sheep that were sort of moving around. Now we've got 100
Yes.
that we're trying to sort of shepherd
Yep.
and move around and move into a fence here and behave it this way. And it can be done, like, but it has to be done thoughtfully and with
Yep.
care, and you have to really know what you're doing. And just like any
I'm
UX
with you.
experience, you have to make it look like it was that way all along, right, and never notice it.
Exactly. And I think that like you're right. You touched on something interesting there too, which is about the like some of the like the changing nature of the job. And I think that I've been doing this for long enough, and I'm showing my age a little bit here, but I know you've been around the show as well, Patrick, so you probably remember this moment too. But I remember in like around it would have been around 2010, people were starting to get writers who were working in UX, and we had various titles back then: content strategist, copywriter, whatever else. Content manager was another one that I know was out there. But like there was a lot of nervousness in the small community back then about, well, okay, if everything becomes like mobile devices, there's not going to be as many words, right? And we're not going to be as needed. We all know that wasn't the case, right? Like you still need people to be creating various types of informational stuff, as I was saying earlier. But the other thing too is that I'm not as bullish that LLMs and AI is going to eat the software world like I think a lot of people are. And let me explain that and how that like connects back to content design. An LLM like Gemini or ChatGPT or Claude or whatever is not going to suddenly replace Monday.com. It's just not,
Mm,
right? There are businesses who have very complex processes set up that they require to be extremely standardized, regulated, understood, trainable, that they need to be able to like put out there and rely on, right? Monday.com
mm,
is a good example of that. Asana, Atlassian, whatever else, any kind of software. And I think that somebody's still going to need to design and build those things. Now, is some elements that are going to get automated by AI? Absolutely. But people, at least for the minute, are still going to need old fashioned quality software. And, you
mm,
know, Facebook hasn't changed its UI to an LLM UI.
mm,
There are still content designers, really talented people thinking about the notification systems and the design systems of that. The tectonic shift hasn't happened as quickly
mm,
as you might have. I think we expected it to happen, and that's excuse me, just gonna like make sure the lights don't turn off. Um, that tectonic shift, if it was going to happen, should have like at least started to happen in earnest by now. But I'm only seeing greater demand for us, and like not any major impacts on hiring. Grain of salt, because this is just my perspective. But also,
sure.
I think that there's just a lot of like engineering level and hardware level things that is going to take years to reckon with.
Mm,
Anyone who's used ChatGPT or Gemini or anything sees the latency issues. Now imagine that at a corporate scale.
mm, yep.
Imagine you're a designer whose UX writer was replaced by an LLM. Now you're trying to have a conversation with it, and you got to like go over and over again. And each turn takes 20 seconds, and then it's still not getting things right. And then suddenly you're getting throttled because and it's getting expensive for the business because they got to pay for that compute power rather than sitting down with a human being where the latency is basically zero and just talking through a problem. I just don't see it in the ways that I think some folks may have thought it would happen. And I could be wrong. I'm going to be wrong with a lot of things that I say and think. Don't get me wrong. but I'm just not as sure that we're about to like get swept up in this tidal wave of change. I think it's a
I
boiling
think
frog scenario.
I think you're right. I think one, I mean, people catastrophize when it comes to these types of things. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
so, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you probably remember 10 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about self-driving cars
Right.
and
Yeah.
how in a few years, self-driving Ubers and self-driving trucks would displace like a whole lot of people. That hasn't happened. And look, I know there's self-driving technology, so
For sure.
still going on, and there's still sort of improvements being made there. But one of the reasons that hasn't happened on that same timeline is because these, as you pointed out, these problems are very difficult to solve. They're very difficult
Hmm.
engineering problems. And I think one of the other things that really interests me is, so we have this AI workshop, and at the beginning we tell people at a very basic level like how a language model works,
Great.
breaking it down into breaking it down into very simple terms, like essentially it's just taking things and turning them into numerical values,
Yeah.
right, and then
Yeah.
establishing the relationships between those things, which is like a horribly simplified way of describing it, but it's
Tokenization or whatever,
yeah, exactly. And then people will say things like, "Oh, so it's not really like thinking," and I'm like, "No, it's not." You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And but it's interesting how many people still like there's just a level of um, disconnect, I think, from the technology that results in people maybe not quite understanding it. And
Mhm.
one thing I just mentioned this, I think in another interview, I said like I think there's a fear where we either take AI too seriously or not seriously enough.
Yeah.
And in the same way, where I see posts where people are talking about everything's going to be powered by an LLM or blah blah blah, at the same time, I also see posts from people being like, this thing hallucinated. It'll never be a
Yeah.
viable piece of technology.
Yeah.
And I'm always like, well, don't be too sure about that because,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a
Who
lot of
knows?
companies making interesting moves at the minute.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think, like as you were saying, the truth is always somewhere in the middle, right? It's somewhere between the doomsayers and the optimists and the people who think that it's just a flash in the pan. I think there's like some point between those positions that is the reality. My position is, which is not what Google thinks. This is purely like my speculation. Is I suspect, and this it's not even that controversial. If I'm being honest with you. I think a lot. I think LLMs and AI is just going to end up powering a bunch of stuff under the hood. I'm not
Yeah.
sure that humans want to like explain everything and then have back and forth. I mean, they might for some things, like they might want to do it when they're trying to shop for something or brainstorming or planning something. Great. But I just think that it'll be used to make things cleverer and more efficient and like just
Mm.
better software and better products. So I don't know that it's even going to like maintain its current form for a whole lot longer. And I think that's a good thing. It matures, it
I,
becomes more useful. We find its
I,
application.
I think so too. I think it's going to become
Yeah.
part of a tech stack, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Likely.
it's a part of the tech stack that is more content oriented, and so that's why I think content designers need to know it. But I think
Agree.
like already you're starting to see less of the. I don't know why there's so many of the rewrite this with AI, and I'm just like I don't want to rewrite it. You know what I mean? Like I'm
Well,
fine with what I've got.
I think, I think one of those things is like, I think a lot of people do like value just to talk about that use case specifically because it's an interesting one. I think a lot of people do value that. And I think that that's actually kind of interesting. It's like, what if AI could democratize excellent writing, right?
Mm,
And I think there's a world in which, I take your point is actually great, which is like we don't need to cram that into every single form field in the world, which is sometimes happens. But I think on the notion of writing, like I'm actually really excited that there are tools that my wife, who speaks English as a second language, can now use when she's writing a performance review to be feel more confident in what she's saying. Right, like that's
totally.
amazing. That's
Yeah.
cool. And I think that there's a lot of things like that. Like imagine that like some kid who may not have had same access to education as other people have had, wants to be like a sci-fi author, now they've got like something that can sit there and like they can drop in their writing and it can help them edit it and explain the edits it's making. And it can do that today. And that compute is cheap. So I think that's actually a really interesting thing. But you're right. Like, do I want a little clippy type thing popping up every time I write an email? Not really.
It's more so that I just think I just look at some experiences and I think, was there a user case here? Like
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mentioned, like
true,
our
for sure.
fundamental search earlier. Like we thought about doing something like that for a while,
Hmm.
and the user need was rooted in people told us there's
Yep,
information in the course that we want to find, and so
for
that's what
sure.
grounded us, right? And it's
Right.
the
Yep.
same thing with I've seen some pretty good examples of, I don't know if you use Zapier, but Zapier, the
Right.
marketplace, I guess, where you can connect apps together.
Yep.
Usually, and beforehand, you would have to sort of look up and be like, I want to connect this to this. Now you go to their site, there's just a text box and it says like, what do you want to do? Right. And so like, what's the thing you're trying to accomplish?
Yep.
And then it'll come up with, oh, here's a recipe for you.
Smart.
And there's another one I saw in our backend for our website where you can put some custom CSS for a page, and instead of having to put the custom
Cool.
CSS there, there's a prompt that says, "What do you want to do?" And then it'll generate some of
Right.
the code to help do that. Now, of course, that's only half the story because you're still going to need the ability to look at that code and be like, oh, there's a colon missing, or there's a bracket, missing here, or
Yeah.
whatever. So there's still the
Yeah.
need for those
Yeah.
elementary skills. But I just think, yeah, the
Yeah.
we're at the point now where the technology is so new that everyone's like, we're going to throw it in everywhere, and yeah, it doesn't end up being
I
the best
know.
experience.
There's a little bit of jubilation among the investing public that I think is driving some of this stuff, for better and for worse. But I think that actually, I mean, we're both Australian, but I think Canva is doing some interesting stuff with AI that I'm pretty bullish on too, which is actually like allowing it to like generate assets and like be a part of like a design workflow. And that is a good example of where AI can democratize something that you may have had to pay someone to do before in a way that
Mm.
is good for businesses, is good for economies. There was this like thing that a VP at Facebook, whose name I'm really blanking on exactly who it was, but they said that our goal as like an ads organization should be to increase the GDP of developing countries.
Mm.
We can talk about like tech colonialism and stuff, and that really justifiable arguments against that to be made. But there was something in there that I liked, which is like technology should be a rising tide that lifts all boats, right?
Mm.
I do think that was what they were getting at, if I'm being honest. But again, like phrased in that clumsy Silicon Valley way. But to get to the point of it, I think that AI is one of those things that could be interesting. And I want to give like a very quick example, which is imagine that AI could code an app in an afternoon for anyone, and then that app becomes a big business, and then that business needs to start hiring UX writers and designers and engineers. I'm not as sure that there's like darkness beyond the horizon. I think when we cross that mountain range, it's going to be either much the same or slightly different, or but still good, or maybe even
Mm.
better. I don't know, but I'm generally an optimist.
Yeah, I mean, I am too. So I think we're
Yeah,
just two optimists talking to each other.
exactly.
But I think like we're sort of coming to the end of that time here. We're just flown by. But one thing I want to ask is for people who are really interested in getting into this type of work, and particularly I'm
Yeah,
thinking of content designers who are sitting there going like, "Oh my God, the AI thing is happening, and I don't really know like
yeah.
how to get involved or what skills I need." What would you tell them in terms of like these are the things you should be looking at and learning and making sure you're on top of?
That's a wonderful question. Um, and I don't have a great like practice answer for that. So give me some rope while I try and like talk through
Sure.
where I think people can find like develop skills and stuff like that. I think honestly, I'm going to give like actually two answers, one being like applicable and one being a little more hand wavy. The applicable one is I would encourage people just to use these products as much as they can.
Hmm.
I would encourage folks to try out like the custom GPTs that ChatGPT has. Gemini is launching Gems soon, which is a similar experience where you can create your own little customized carve outs. play with those and just see, like, get to understand, like, how do you guide a model to do things. It's like, in a certain sense, like very basic fine tuning for specific purposes. So do that. I would try and do like interesting things that like are valuable to you with these models as well, just to see if they're good at it or not. A lot of the time they're not, but you're going to learn something from that. And I think just getting comfortable with the machinery is important. The other thing I would encourage content designers and UX writers and conversation designers who are getting more engrossed in this sort of stuff is to deal more with long form content. Read short stories, try writing them, try piping them through LLMs, try getting LLMs to write them and rewrite them. And why I say that is like those to me, like on the one hand, like understanding what is good is like a really powerful thing when you're working with an LLM. And it varies a lot, but like having a really, good sense of what makes a great story or a great piece of writing, which a lot of us are good at, but like extending that understanding knowledge is powerful because LLMs are doing more of that. But also just like asking them to generate or edit a piece of writing brings to the fore what is good at and not good at. And I'll give you an example that I think is interesting sometimes is if you drop in something written in like a specific style guide, let's say you write it following AP style and you say, rewrite it in, the Australian government style guide. It does it kind of half well and half it just misses the mark. And then you start to see, okay, like where does it learn it from? Now, what does it know? What does it not know? And stuff like that. Also just like getting it to like provide edits to a story, get it to describe things in a way that's meant to be emotive. You start to see this is a machine. It is not a thinking, feeling person, right? And honestly, I everyone who's listening to this, go to like ChatGPT or Gemini or any of these products and say, write me a short story about losing a loved one or something very emotional. And the adjectives and the way it describes things will just be a little bit wrong because it can't feel or think, right? And that's an important lesson to learn, but it also shows you some of the limitations. So not a great answer, I would say, because it's hard to like go out and build hard skills, but also just be open to change because it's a changing thing. Things are getting standardized fast. There are new problems that we need to solve coming up every single day. The technology itself is getting better in some ways, more complex in other ways. So just don't be afraid of it, embrace it, and don't worry too much, I think, is kind of the thing I would leave you with. Is like, it's
Just
not
chill
a
out.
thing. Just chill. Yeah, I mean,
Just
it's
chill.
easy to say when I'm like experienced. I've been doing this for a long time working, so I do want to like say I have empathy. I get it. I really, really do. In fact, there was a really great article. I think it was in the New Yorker, or maybe it was the Times. I can't remember. And it was an interviewed a bunch of science fiction editors. They like edit like really great magazines. I think it was like Sci-Fi and Fantasy, Clarkesworld, really famous, really great magazines. And they were all talking about how as soon as ChatGPT came out, they went from having a couple of hundred submissions a month to thousands.
Yeah,
Because
right.
people were
Yeah,
like, I'm just
just
going to do
using
this.
it.
But like, what was interesting about that is like, first of all, they all were like, it's easy to spot the AI generated stuff now. But the other thing that was interesting to me was people were just like thought the LLMs were better at these things than they weren't. They thought that they could say, write me a science fiction story about being stranded on the moon or whatever. Or on the Mars, being the Martian, but let's say the moon so it doesn't sound like I'm copying something directly. And they'd read it and be like, wow, that's really cool. But it's only cool because you're holding it to this really low standard of a machine. You send that to somebody editing a sci-fi magazine, they're going to read it and be like, what is this? This is not that. So I think like getting to understand like what it's good at and what it's not good at is a really powerful thing. And it will help you when and if you have to work on one, because now you understand the problem set.
I completely agree. I think that the existence of technology just doesn't necessarily indicate a rise in quality. I mean, like everyone carries one of these around, right?
Yeah.
Which the equivalent of a camera like this would have cost 50 grand back in the 90s, something like that. Just because they exist doesn't mean everyone's going around shooting feature films, like,
Well
so
put.
I think that there needs to be
Couldn't agree more.
a desire on behalf of the people using it to create something meaningful.
Couldn't agree more. And I think honestly, getting back to like our discipline and our trade, the fundamental things that we're good at and the fundamental value we bring is the same. And that is something that I know you talk about a lot. But I also hold it to be very true is that like you need smart people who understand the nature of language, the nature of content, the nature of information. How do you deliver that? The fundamentals are not dramatically different.
Mm.
The outputs and the tooling and the scaffolding that we're putting around it may look a bit different. But once you get your head around that, the learning curve isn't as steep, I think, as some people think. I think people hear
Yeah.
about training, they're like, oh, that's really hard. And it is really complex. But once you understand like what you're doing, you're like, oh, interesting.
Mm.
I kind of did that in various types of UX research that I used to do, or this project that I did years ago. There's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah.
So I would say to
Absolutely.
like content designers, keep doing what you're doing and keep focusing on what you're good at, and you're gonna be fine.
Well, speaking of smart people, thank you for joining the podcast today. Where
Well,
can
that's
people
very
find
kind.
you if they want
Of
to
course.
connect with you?
The best place to reach me would probably be over LinkedIn. I don't really use Twitter/X these that much these days. Um, if you want to share my personal email, you're welcome to. I'll give that to you if you can like provide that in the details. It's a long one, so I won't spell it out here because of my silly long name. But yeah, I'm always excited to hear from folks, and I'm always happy to talk about folks' journey. I'm a big believer, as I know you are, Patrick, in like democratizing our experiences as much as we can, making them accessible. And I love how y'all provide like scholarships to like uplift people. So but I try to do that just as a one person sort of thing. And so I love to hear from folks. So reach out.
Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes. Ben, thank you so much for today. This has been really great.
A
And
pleasure.
when the LLMs have taken over everything in a few more years, you'll come back on. We'll talk about it more then.
Yeah, or it will just be two AI clones of ourselves having the same conversation.
Oh, no thanks.
No,
All right,
I
thanks,
hope
Ben.
that doesn't happen either, because this is